In this lecture, we're going to talk about the appendicular skeleton. And it's composed of 126 bones, and it makes up your limbs or appendages, the pectoral girdle, which is how your arm attaches. It also forms your shoulder, and your pelvic girdle, which is how your legs are attached to the trunk of your body. So in this diagram, you can see that the skeleton that is represented in kind of the bone color, for lack of a better word, those are all the bones that form the appendicular skeleton. So it's, again, your shoulder girdle, your arm, your pelvic girdle, and your leg. And from the anterior side, you can see it includes things like your shoulder blade and your pelvis. The pectoral girdle, or your shoulder girdle, is composed of two bones. So one of those bones is the clavicle. You can see that one on the front of your body. It's on the anterior side. It's also called the collarbone. It articulates with your sternum and with your scapula. And then the second bone that makes up the shoulder girdle is the scapula, also called your shoulder blade. And it articulates with the clavicle at something called the acromioclavicular joint. And it articulates with the arm bone at something called the glenoid cavity. These bones allow the upper limb to have a lot of free movement. That joint where your arm meets your shoulder is considered a ball and socket joint, and so it gives your arm tremendous range of motion. Here you can see the two bones that make up your shoulder girdle. So the clavicle is one, that's this long bone that extends from your sternum over to the point of your shoulder. And then the scapula is this kind of wing-shaped bone. And the point here is the acromion, that's kind of the point of your shoulder. And then where your arm meets is the glenoid cavity here. In this diagram, you can see what the clavicle looks like. So it meets your sternum at this end, and then it meets your acromial end, or the acromion of the scapula at this end. And this is what it looks like from the anterior side and from the back, which is the posterior side, which is the side you don't see as often, right? Even on yourself, because that's what faces in towards your body. And then in this image, you can see this is the posterior side of your scapula. It's got this big, long spine and a lot of muscles attached there. This is the side where the acromion is. So if you remember from when we did body regions, this is where the acromial region shares a name with the part of the bone that's there. And then right in front of the acromion is where the glenoid cavity sits, and that's where the humerus, the bone in your upper arm, articulates with the scapula. And then the body of the scapula here is what kind of lies over the top of your rib cage, and it kind of looks like a wing. The anterior side of your scapula looks like this. You get a better view of that glenoid cavity where the humerus articulates, and you can see that core, or the acromion, which is that point of your shoulder. And this side of the bone is much flatter because you don't have to articulate large muscles to this side of the scapula. Moving to your upper limb, so this is your arm. The humerus is the bone that articulates directly to the scapula. It forms the arm. It's a single bone, and the proximal end of articulation, which is where the head of the bone is, articulates with the glenoid cavity of the scapula to form your shoulder joint. At the distal end, it articulates with the bones of your forearm at a place called the trochlea and the capitulum, and that is what forms the joint with the radius and ulna. So this is what the humerus looks like. The head of the humerus articulates with the glenoid cavity, and then the capitulum and the trochlea, which are at the distal end, articulate with the radius and the ulna. You'll notice there's also some bony markings, such as the deltoid tuberosity. That's a projection on the bone where the deltoid attaches. On the posterior side, you can see, again, you can still see the head of the humerus, and then there's also the olecranal or olecranon fossa. So if you remember the olecranal region, that's where your elbow is. That's where this is also located. Moving to the forearm, there are two bones that make the forearm up. There's the ulna, That is the medial bone when you are standing in anatomical position, which means that your thumbs are facing outward and your hands, palms of your hands are facing forward. At the proximal end, it articulates with the coronoid process, and the olecranon articulates with the humerus. The other bone in the forearm is the radius. It's the lateral bone when you're in standard anatomical position, and at the proximal end, it articulates to the humerus with the capitulum of the humerus. These two bones are next to each other. They're parallel when your hands are palms forward, and the bones will cross each other and make an X when you turn your palms backwards. At the proximal end of the ulna, you'll see the olecranon. So the olecranal region is named for that part of the bone. That makes the point of your elbow, and it kind of nestles into that olecranal fossa that's on the humerus. You'll also notice that these two bones are connected to each other by something called the interosseous membrane, and that's cartilaginous tissue that helps the bones stay relative to one another where they need to be. You'll notice that the radius at the top is kind of round, and that's because that bone is able to pivot. And at the distal end, these two bones articulate with the bones of the wrist. So the hand is actually made up of the carpals, which are the bones in your wrist. There's 8 of them. They're arranged in 2 rows of 4 bones each. Then you have long bones in your hand that are called the metacarpals. Those form your palm. You've got 5 metacarpals. And then your fingers and your thumb are made of phalanges. So you have 14 phalanges. Your fingers have 3 bones each, and your thumb has 2. So here's what the bones of the hand look like. Again, you've got 8 carpals. So those are the bones that form your wrist and articulate with the radius and ulna. And then you have 5 metacarpals. And then you have 14 bones that make up your phalanges or fingers. Moving on to the pelvic girdle. It's formed by 2 coxal bones, and each bone has 3 fused bones that make up its parts. So they're made up of the ilium, the ischium, and the pubis. The pelvic girdle is made up of those 2 coxal bones and the sacrum, and then the whole entire bony pelvis includes the coxal bones, the sacrum, and also the coccyx. Your pelvis is large and heavy because it does most of your weight bearing. The total weight of your upper body rests on your pelvis, and it also protects several organs, including your reproductive organs, your bladder, and the end of your large intestine. So again, that coxal bone is made up of 3 fused sections. So it's made up of the ilium, the pubis, and the ischium. And then some of the kind of notable parts of this bone, the iliac crest is the flare of your hip that you can kind of feel through your skin. When people talk about their hips, that's usually the part they are referring to. The coxal bones are attached to the sacrum through the sacroiliac joint, which is right there. And then the 2 bones are fused in the front at the pubic symphysis. And there's a piece of cartilage there that's the same type of cartilage that is between the bodies of your vertebrae. Laterally, you can see the 3 sections of this bone more easily. So again, the ilium is this bone. And so it's going to be all the bone that's here. That's kind of that buff color. And then the ischial body of the bone is here, or the ischium is here, and then the pubis is this section of bone here. And so those are the 3 parts of the pelvis. And then you can also see where the femur articulates. So that's this joint cavity called the acetabulum, and so that's where the femur, ball of the femur, can sit in the joint cavity and allow your hips to have, or the joint between your trunk and your leg to have a fairly large range of motion. There are some gender differences in the pelvis. In females, the inlet is a little bit larger and it's a little bit more circular, and that's because it forms the birth canal. The female pelvis is also a little bit shallower, and the bones are a little bit lighter and thinner. And the female ilia flare a little bit more laterally. The female sacrum is also a little shorter and less curved so that it doesn't interfere with the birth canal. And then the female ischial spines are shorter and farther apart, so that way the outlet can be a little bit larger. There's also on the front of the pelvis a structure called the pubic arch, and the female pubic arch has an angle that is larger than 90 degrees typically. The male angle is usually less than 90 degrees. So when you look at a male pelvis and a female pelvis, you'll notice they look a little bit different. The male pelvis is a little bit taller, generally speaking, and narrower. And then the pubic arch is less than 90 degrees, and the inlet of the pelvis is going to be a little bit less round. In the female, the pelvis is a little bit shorter, the ilia are a little bit wider and more flared, the inlet is a little bit larger, and the pubic arch is more than 90 degrees. Moving on to the bones you find in legs. So the femur is the bone that makes up your thigh bone. It's the heaviest and strongest bone in the body. It has a tremendous amount of strength. The proximal end articulation articulates again with the acetabulum of the coxal or the hip bone. And at the distal end, there are lateral and medial condyles that articulate with the tibia, which is the weight-bearing bone in the lower leg. So this is what a femur looks like. The head of the femur articulates with the pelvis. The head is situated on the neck of the femur, and then you have some really large muscle groups that attach to the greater and lesser trochanter. Here you can see the lesser trochanter, the greater trochanter is here. And then at the distal end, you've got these condyles. There's a lateral and medial condyle where the bone articulates with the lower leg, and there's also the patellar surface where the patella sits. In this view, you can also see the greater trochanter, and that is where some really large muscles attach. And then at the distal end, you've got the lateral condyle, medial condyle, and then this fossa. So it's just a depression in the bone between the two condyles. The lower leg has two bones. So one of them is the tibia. That's the one that's the shin bone. It's larger and it's medially oriented. It is the weight-bearing bone of the lower leg, and it's the one that articulates with the femur to form the knee. The fibula is thin and stick-like. It's lateral to the tibia, and it has no role in forming the knee joint. It's not really a weight-bearing bone, but it does help with muscle attachments and support. So you can see here the difference between the tibia and the fibula. The tibia is a much larger, heavier bone. Both bones play a role in the ankle joint, but at the top, only the tibia plays a role in the knee joint. They are also, much like the radius and ulna, attached to each other by this interosseous membrane to help stabilize the bones. When you get down to the foot, much like the feet, you have, instead of carpals, you have tarsals, which are the bones of the ankle, metatarsals, which are the long bones that form the sole of your foot, and then a bunch of little bones that form your phalanges, otherwise known as your toes. So the tarsals are made up of several cuboidal bones. The talus is the bone that articulates with the bones of your lower leg, and so it's a pretty heavy weight-bearing bone as far as ankle bones go. The calcaneus is the bone that forms your heel, and then there's several others that you don't need to know the names of, at least for this class. And then the metatarsals are the bones that form the sole of your feet, and then you also have phalanges. Again, there's distal, middle, and proximal bones in your phalanges. The bones in your feet form a couple of arches, and they form 3 different strong arches, and that allows your very small feet to support all of the weight of your body, even when you're doing like high impact activities like running and jumping. So there's 2 longitudinal arches and 1 transverse arch. So on your feet, you have a medial arch. That's usually the higher arch. That's the one that's towards the inside of your foot. You also have a lateral arch, usually a little shallower, but it's on the outside of your foot. And then running from right to left, you have a transverse arch, and that allows your feet, again, to be springy, because arches are very strong structures. That's why we use them to support buildings and things in architecture.